Hello everyone, my name is John, I'm the Geeky Fanboy, and welcome back to me talking about books. I did a little teaser for this idea a while ago when I asked on my community tab if, the bookworms out there, if you're reading classic literature, because I feel like classic literature is a genre, especially like online, that tends to be a bit more of a niche topic, but for the people who are into classics, it's like a really passionate kind of thing. So I was interested in seeing what you people read, and most of you said that you do enjoy a good classic now and then. Some of you even said that it's one of your main genres. Now, as someone who studied English, I think it's obligated that I'm into classic literature. Um, but I have to admit, in like the last couple of years since I finished my studies, I've read less like classic literature, but it's something it's a genre I sort of want to get back into this year, and sort of as maybe as a starter for that, I decided to do a bunch of like classic novels and books and authors. Now, disclaimer, some of the books and authors we'll see here I haven't read in a while, so some of the impressions I have on this book will be like based on memories from like 3 or 4, even all like longer ago. There are also like some classic authors in here that I unfortunately haven't read yet, but plan on doing so, or it's been literally like so long, like as in decade, that I do not remember what I thought of them at the time, which is why certain authors you might think of right now will not be in this video. But I want to repeat this in maybe like 1 or 2 years when I've read some more classics, and we can go and re-rank some of those too. And I also focus this list on not only like old classics, so yes, there will be like Shakespeare and Mary Shelley, like all that stuff will be there, but I also try to include some more modern classics that we consider modern classics of a specific genre. So there will also be books that came out, I'm not even sure if some of them I include came out in the 21st century, but there will also, there are books that came out in the 21st century on this list, but also like some books that came out in the 90s that we consider modern day classics. So without further ado, let's jump into some tier ranking. Okay, here we are. Here is the classic literature tier list. Let me quickly introduce you to our tiers. At the very bottom, we have Fire from Literary Canon. So, of course, canon is like the group of books that are generally considered to be, essential to, like, I don't know, Western literature or English-speaking Western literature. And this is like the bottom category, which means I do not understand whatsoever why this is considered a classic book, and I did not enjoy it at all. Then above that we have this one, really? Well, I'm like, I guess I can kind of see it, but deep down I'm like, really? This one is like well renowned? Then sort of as a middle category we have If You Must, which is like, okay, yeah, I mean, if it interests you, like, give it a try. It's like a yes or no kind of thing, depending on what you're into. Then we got Ooh, I Like This, which I think is self-explanatory. It's just books that I read where I'm like, ooh, I really like this. This is pretty good. And then top tier, I call literature gods. So these are really like classic pieces of literature where I'm like, yep, totally get it. This is one of the best books ever written. Everyone should have read that one. And I totally get it why this is considered to be one of the best books of all time. And of course, as a general disclaimer, all of my opinions are completely subjective. I know I will probably put some books in the higher categories that some people will argue, wow, that's the most boring book I've ever read, and I will probably put some books in the lower categories where other people are like, what? This is like one of the best books ever written. So obviously, it's all based on my own subjective personal opinion. Keep that in mind, and please feel free to tell me down in the comments below how you would rank some of these books if you have read them. Let's jump into it. As you can see, there were like so many books I didn't manage to like fit them all down there, so we have to start on the side here. And let's see what we're starting with. We are starting with The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. Now, one of the last classes I took during my studies was a class on Oscar Wilde. So I had to read stuff like The Importance of Being Earnest and Picture of Dorian Gray and all that. And Importance of Being Earnest. I would argue it's probably gonna go in I like this. Because I think Importance of Being Earnest is really, really funny. In a very witty language kind of way. Bumbling and all that is, I think, even a phrase that other people who may not even have read this play know about. I think it's a great comedy based on like this idea of a false identity. Who do you say you are on the outside? Who are you actually on the inside? Of course, there's some satire, but like based on the upper classes and all that, which I think Oscar Wilde managed to do quite well, or depict well in most of his works. And it's basically about like this young man who pretends to be one person when he goes to visit like people he knows on like outside the country, while he's actually in real life someone completely else. And then his friend, who he tells the story to, basically decides, well, maybe I'm going to pretend to be that fancy version of you, and goes to visit like those people in the countryside and pretends to be the essentially also a different person. So there's like a mix-up, who is wooing which girl, all that. As always with Oscar Wilde, there's like a little bit of like a potential gay reading of the entire story. So I think it's really funny if you manage to like catch a version of this live like in the theatre. I think you won't be disappointed and you're gonna have a very good time. And we're gonna stay with Oscar Wilde, and let's talk about The Picture of Dorian Gray. The Picture of Dorian Gray, I think I've read like 2 or 3 times, also because of my studies, but also I think the first time I read it, I didn't even had a class on it. I just liked the idea of it. Obviously, we all kind of know what Picture of Dorian Gray is about. It's about a young, handsome man who in the beginning of the novel is like sort of innocent, and comes to London, and then meets 2 men who are almost like an angel devil kind of figures, where like one of them is like really almost like in love with him, wants to paint a beautiful picture of him because he just sees like this innocent beauty that he has, while his other friend lives more of a bohemian lifestyle. It's all about like the enjoyment of life. So it's all a bit more about, going out at night, is sleeping around, that kind of stuff, drugs, just live in the moment, enjoy life, that kind of thing. And then Dorian slowly like falls into depravity as he sells his soul to the devil, essentially, which is manifested within the painting that has been made of him, the picture of Dorian Gray. And he basically stays immortal, never ages, and all the sins and awful things he commits within the span of his life don't reflect on him, but on his picture. So I think this is probably Oscar Wilde's most well-known work that he's ever written, more so than any of his plays, more than Importance of Being Earnest. There have been many different versions of this story, none of which are ever seem to be like completely accurate to the novel itself. But this is like such an interesting piece of like Victorian Gothic literature about like the nature of man, how far can you go really in like this idea of how much do you enjoy life, how far can you go without like completely ignoring all moralities, ignoring the way you treat people, the way you treat yourself, and just live in sin, essentially, which in and of itself especially in the beginning, isn't necessarily a bad thing, because yes, he's like, Dorian starts as a bit naive, like stiff upper lip, that kind of thing, and then he's being told, there are other things in life that you can enjoy, and you should allow yourself to, indulge a bit now and then, which in and of itself isn't wrong, but then Dorian just basically goes off the deep end. There are like many different ways I think you can read this novel. And I'm gonna say this is our first god of literature, because I think there's a good reason why this is considered to be like one of like the classic books of Victorian and Gothic literature, because it picks up so many themes that were present at the time, and I think many people can even identify with nowadays, because it's all about, vanity. How do you see yourself? How do you get influenced by people around you? And how much do you allow yourself to indulge in certain things while forgetting who maybe you yourself are, or forgetting like society's morality system? Is it even a morality system that's good? All those kinds of ideas are coming up here, which is, and all of those are, I think, very interestingly picked up in this novel, which is why this is definitely one of the best books that's ever been written. Now let's jump to a completely different one, tone-wise. Let's jump to a more modern classic, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I've only put the first one here because to be honest, I haven't read the other ones. I still plan on reading the entire series, but I'm putting the first one here. It's been a while since I've read it. I don't know if it's an unpopular opinion, but I also actually quite like the movie. But yes, this is the first novel by Douglas Adams, which I think with not only within the sci-fi genre, especially in this, this book's like just iconic with its very specific, random sense of humor, which is also very meta in a certain kind of way, and it's just completely nonsensical, but with like always with a wink. It always feels very witty. Like it seems random, but it also feels like it's on purpose. And I can totally see why this is like by many people considered to be like such a cult classic, even though I think not enough people know this novel yet. So I would argue it's somewhere between literature gods and ooh, I like this. I don't know, I feel like it's such a cult classic. It has influenced other authors and other works over time, even though I think like some people like in recent years maybe it's been not as well known as other books. But I think it's definitely a book you should check out if you're like into sci-fi, and if you're a bit into like a weird sense of humor, a bit like almost like a little bit like Terry Pratchett, maybe, if you want like a fantasy equivalent here. So I'm gonna put this in. I liked it because it's definitely a very well written, very funny book that I think anyone should check out who's just willing to like get into something that's a bit off and a bit weird, and I think you'll have a very good time with this. Next up, we have another more modern classic, one I also had to read during my studies, namely Life of Pi. Now, Life of Pi, when I had to read it, I had no real idea, but I knew that the movie had come out a few years prior to that, and all I knew was, oh, it's about a young man on the boat with a tiger. That's sort of all I knew. And that certainly is a large chunk of this book. But what I think a lot of people don't know is that there's like a whole lot of other stuff going on before he lands on that boat. Like a lot we learn about the character's childhood, like his view on religion and philosophy. I remember that when I read this, I thought it was really interesting that the main character gets into like all sorts of different world religions and essentially subscribes to each and every one of them, and then all like the people for all the like spiritual leaders from those religions come up to him and are like, you told me you're a member of my religion, but now this other guy told me you're also a member of his religion, and this other guy also said that you're a member of his religion. Like, how does that work? And he's like, well, I like each and every single religion, and I think all of these things make sense, and why can't God like be have multiple versions essentially, which I thought was such an interesting concept. And then you get him on the boat in like the later part of the novel, and it's not just a tiger, he's also there with like other animals, and in the end of course he gets rescued and tries to retell the story, and there's a lot of discussion about did this literally actually happen to him as he's telling the story? Like, were the animals actually really there with him on the boat? Or is it more of a representation or metaphor for something else? So, I remember that I enjoyed it when I read it for the first time. I don't know if I would enjoy it as much now. I also wouldn't necessarily put it in the same category as Hitchhiker's Guide and Importance of Being Earnest. So I'm gonna put it in the if you must, because I don't think it's essential reading. I think it's a very interesting book to get into if you're up for something a bit more like philosophical, religious, but not something that's like too theoretical, but still has some interesting ideas to play with. Next up, we have an author, actually, because he wrote like so many different things, but only, I think, one full novel ever in his lifetime. I don't know. Namely, we got Edgar Allan Poe. And Edgar Allan Poe, no discussion, is a god of literature. Without Edgar Allan Poe, that we wouldn't have, for example, we wouldn't have detective stories as we know them. The Sherlock Holmes stories are gonna come up later by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and Edgar Allan Poe's works like are the ones that were the whole basis for this entire classic detective genre as we know it. And Murders of the Rue Morgue and all that, with Dupin as a detective. He's the one who came up with all of that. So basically, laid the groundwork for like an entire subgenre, very popular subgenre of crime fiction. And added to that, we have his entire Gothic literature, like his short stories, his poetry, stuff that's so utterly haunting and beautiful, melancholy. That I've always loved reading Edgar Allan Poe. Like I think I read some of his stories the first time, like in school when I was 15, 16 years old. Immediately fell in love with them. Also, Edgar Allan Poe is like the original goth kid. Like he was the original goth, essentially, and so it was only a question of time when I would eventually get into his work. So like definitely god of literature. Especially if you want to get like into classic gothic haunting fiction, you definitely have to check out Edgar Allan Poe's short stories. My personal favorites are Telltale Heart's probably my favorite Edgar Allan Poe short story. Black Cat I also quite like. Like I said, Murders in the Rue Morgue if you want something that's more on, based on like crime detective stories. Castle of Amontillado is great. Pit in the Pantheon if you want something that's actually like a bit more gruesome, almost splatter movie-ish. Like definitely go and read some Edgar Allan Poe. Also definitely check out his poetry. I absolutely adore his poetry in general. I'm like a fan of the 19th century Gothic and romantic kind of literature, especially poetry, like Lord Byron, Edgar Allan Poe. It's my shit. So yeah, go and read Edgar Allan Poe. There's nothing you can do wrong there. Just check out some stuff. Next up, we got a play, because I wanted to include some plays as well, and I wanted to include something by Tom Stoppard. So I included Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. We're going to talk about some Shakespeare later. Actually, it would have helped if we had talked about Shakespeare before this, but what the hell. So Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead are maybe arguably Tom Stoppard's most famous play. There's also a movie based on this play with Gary Oldman and Tim Roth, two actors I like a lot. I think the movie is from the, I'm not even quite sure, 80s or something, 90s. And Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead is a play that is basically a very meta-based story surrounding two secondary characters from Hamlet. So Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are two of Hamlet's former friends or student buddies, essentially. And this play essentially takes these two characters and tells us what happened before they met Hamlet, what happens when they meet Hamlet at Elsinore, but we don't see them in the play, and how do they actually come to die. Spoiler, but I guess that's well known because, you know, Hamlet is literally centuries old. And this is a very, I will argue, I think Thomas Stoppard, or maybe this play especially, maybe not, the humor is maybe not for everyone. It has a lot of like also nonsensical language-based humor. There are a lot of like dialogue scenes, just like with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, with the two characters, just like talking to each other about seemingly nonsensical stories, making very weird puns or using weird language or playing a weird language-based game, that I don't think everyone will sort of vibe with that. But considering that I'm a bit of a Shakespeare nerd and Hamlet's literally my favorite play of all time, that's my shit. Not only do I love Hamlet, but I also love meta humor. I love meta narratives, so stories that are about stories, that kind of thing, and that stories that are aware that they are a story themselves, that they're sort of aware that they're fictional. And this play is all about that. And I'm just, you know what? I'm just gonna say God of Literature, because this is one of my favorite plays, and great, especially if you're like a Shakespeare nerd. This is like such a great piece to accompany Shakespeare, and especially Hamlet, of course. Like, basically, if you've read or watched Hamlet, you basically have to immediately get into Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which is basically like a funny meta version, weird version of Hamlet. So definitely go and check this one out if you're already familiar with Shakespeare. Okay, now we're continuing down here at the bottom. Where are we starting? Let's start off with, like, here on the left. This is a book I have read quite recently. Namely, we got The Stranger by Albert Camus. And I already spoke about this book not too long ago, and I quite enjoyed it. I'm probably going to put it in the I like this. Because Albert Camus, I have been aware of before. I know that there's another book called The Plague, which I also still want to get into. And I knew that his works are very philosophical. So I was sort of expecting like a sort of bit of a complex narrative, a writing style that was maybe a bit hard to get into, but actually no. Like, I was quite almost positively surprised that when I got into The Stranger, it's the writing style itself is surprisingly simple and surprisingly easy to read. But nevertheless still manages to tell, like with that style, manages to tell quite interesting stories. So The Stranger is about a man who could clinically be described as a psychopath, so someone who's completely blunt and numb to like his feelings, to morality. Like, he will do awful things throughout the novel just to be like, nah, why not? Or let's see what happens, I guess. Sort of like that. And then he ends up committing a crime, and the crime lands him in prison. And it's basically it's more of a character study really than an actual story, with just sort of following this man who is not even very likable. Like, he's so far removed from like his own feelings that he's not really self-aware of himself. He's not even really aware of himself as a human, what like humanity is, what morality really means, and sort of following him, almost like down spiraling in his behavior, simply because he doesn't have the concept of like morality on his mind, or something that he is aware of but has no emotional connection with. So I think that's quite an interesting book, like about what it means to be human. There's also a bit about like status and class in there as well. So I think this is a very interesting character study, and I'm gonna put it into I like this, because when I finished it, I definitely wanted to read more by this author. Next up, we got something that's actually not it's actually not originally in English, namely The Honshin Murders by Yokomizo. Seishi Yokomizo. I'm so sorry for my pronunciation. Also a book I read quite recently, because I'm a big fan of like not only detective stories but whodunits. Who doesn't love a whodunit? And this is a Japanese classic about very basic whodunit detective story. It's a locked room murder mystery connected to a big family. It's set at a wedding, and on the wedding night, the couple gets murdered. No one knows why. No one knows how. The room is locked. No one could have gotten in. And the entire family is baffled. And they're calling the police for aid, and the police calls a detective for help who's a little Sherlock Holmes-ish. He's a little bit odd, he's a little bit weird, but nevertheless likable, and he's called in to solve the case. And this is just like a very classic whodunit. I had a lot of fun with it. It was a little complicated at times, like a bit too much, because there are a lot of characters. It's like it's quite a big family. This whole story is about. In the edition I had, which was quite helpful, there was like a glossary in the back where you could like look up what the Japanese words mean that the author used throughout the book, because a lot of like not only the locations are described, but like the architecture about certain stages of people within the Japanese social hierarchy, and it was quite helpful to sort of have this glossary in the back to like look up what that actually meant. This had also a major like Detective Conan vibe, like if you're familiar with that anime, like Case Close, that anime, definitely felt like that. It's just sort of have the story, this is the family the story is about, we get to know them a little bit, then suddenly murder, police are called, and then we got a cool little weird detective who's coming in to solve the murder, and at the very end we get like this big Junior Moore moment where the detective sits everyone down and is like, okay, here's what happened. And I love that. I know that a lot of detective stories do this, and it's always the same, but I just love that. So, yeah, I quite enjoyed this. It's not like Gods of Literature. I did enjoy it, but I don't think it's necessarily something you have to read, which is why I'm gonna say, if you must, if like me, you're a fan of like the classic like golden age of detective literature, like crime literature, Agatha Christie kind of stuff, Poirot. If you're like really into that kind of genre, then I would say you could give this one a read. Next up, let's continue over here. Next up, we got a quite well-known book. We got Lita by Nabokov. It's been a while since I read this. I think I read this 3 or 4 years ago during the pandemic together with a friend, because we had heard of this book, of course we had, but had never read it, so we decided to do a body read. And I have to say, quite interesting. What got me about this book was that everyone said that obviously there are a lot of misconceptions surrounding this book, and I sort of knew that going in, that there were a lot of misconceptions surrounding the book, and I was interested to see how the book actually addresses the theme of, an adult man, an older adult man feeling romantically and also sexually attracted to underaged girls. I think he, like, even within the book, he like specifies the age of girls he's attracted to, which I'm not even quite sure what it was, like 9 to 13 or 14-year-olds or something like that. And obviously the book never depicts this man's behavior as good. Like, it's told from the man's point of view, who's called Humbert. Yes, I know, funny. But the novel never justifies his feelings. It never says what he's doing is acceptable. Like, even Humbert himself within the book says, this is weird. What I'm feeling is not normal, and no one else should do this. But I can't help it. That's sort of what's going on. And then, of course, he gets to know Lita, who I'm not even quite sure how old she is, 12 or something. And they get to know each other, he starts having those weird feelings, and then he essentially kind of kidnaps her, and they go on a bit of a road trip, and Lolita doesn't even really know what's going on. Of course, she feels like, I've been spending so much time with this man, do I like him? But of course you're like, no you don't, you're like 12 years old and he's like 50. This is super fucked up. And then she also tries to run away, and there's a lot of stuff going on here. I know a lot of people say the language in this book is quite interesting, which, yes, it is. It isn't like really straight up written. It is sort of a bit flowery, very prosaic, or not quite philosophical at times, but what surprised me when I read reviews for this book after I finished it was that a lot of people were like, oh, this is funny. A lot of people, this has almost like a satirical, humorous tone, which for me didn't land at all while I was reading that. I didn't get that at all. And I see why people find this book so interesting. However, it didn't leave that much of an impression on me, apart from like the general premise that the book is about. So I'm sort of torn between If You Must and this one, really, because it's not a bad book. I think it's interesting, but I would argue not necessarily one you have to have read, unless you really want to get into like the literary canon discourse. But I'm gonna say If You Must, because I do get it, but it's not necessarily a book where I would say, yeah, definitely go and read that. You're missing out if you read this. Not necessarily what I would argue, so this is why it goes here. Next up, we have a book by a German author, Kafka, The Trial. I have a hate relationship with Kafka. I had to read this book years ago since I live in Germany, so this is a book I read for like a German class. And I hated it. I do not like Kafka at all. The thing is, I totally get why Kafka is being read. I understand why he is so like well renowned within, especially like the German literary canon. But I remember when I read The Trial, I hated it because this book explains nothing to you, which is sort of the point. Like, it's about the main character who's I'm not even quite sure if we get an actual name. F, I think his name's just F, like the letter F. He wakes up one day and is told by two strangers that there's going to be a trial for him. He's going to be sentenced for a crime. There's going to be a trial. And he has no idea what they're on about. He has no idea what the trial's about, what he's done, who these people are. He's dragged to like all sorts of weird places to meet up with people who tell him essentially nothing. And for me, it was a very frustrating read. Because at the end of the book, you know basically as much as you did at the very beginning. Namely, nothing. You know nothing about why they sentenced him for the crime he did, why they put him on trial. Nothing. You know, none of that is ever answered. And again, I get that that's the point. But if you're like me and you kind of need a red thread, you need a point to where the story is going, this is so frustrating to read. And I just can't with books that are trying to be like this vague and confusing on purpose. Because it's not even funny. It's just like straight up a story about a guy who, just as the reader, has no idea what the fuck is going on. And then the book ends and you're like, what the fuck was the point? I know there's a niche out there of people who really like Kafka. And I totally get it. It's interesting, especially if you like get a bit into the background of the author. Lots of like mental health stuff, like traveling daddy issues, all of that. But I hated reading this. I honestly did. The funny thing is, after I read this, like a couple of months later, I saw a play based on another of his books. Metamorphosis, I think. The one where he turns into a beetle. And the thing is, as a play in the theatre, I had much more fun with his stories because I didn't have to read his awful writing, probably. How harsh am I going to be with this? To me personally, this is one of the books I never want to touch again. So, for me personally, I'm going to say fired from literary canon. Because I just don't get it. I hate this book so much. But I with this, at least I can kind of see, I guess, why people like this. Can I, though? I'm honestly not sure. Can I? No, you know what? Let's be harsh. I'm just going to be harsh. Because I think there are books by Kafka that are more interesting from sort of the bit of reading I've done on the side. But this book is essentially the story, almost all of Kafka's future works for me. Like, I hated it so much. I was like, I'm probably never going to touch another Kafka book again, which isn't entirely true. But I just didn't get it. I can see why people think he's interesting and his work, but it just really wasn't for me. Okay, let's continue over here. We have a spooky book, which I also read only a few months ago. We got The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. The Haunting of Hill House was quite interesting. It is considered to be like a cult classic, sort of in like the gothic-y spooky books. I'm not quite sure from when this is, the 50s or the 60s. And it's about a young woman who takes part in like supernatural experiment with other people in a seemingly haunted house, and weird things start happening there at night. And that's sort of most of the book. But at the same time, you sort of get the idea that not everything's quite well with the main character. So you're also in between a bit of she's experiencing those horrors. Is she imagining some of it? Is she like really psychologically well? There's also a lot of like great sapphic chemistry between the two women in the book. And the thing for me was this book drags a bit. The thing is when it's not about the actual hauntings, it's a bit boring. But when the book gets to like the actual haunting bits, when it's like spooky and gets to nighttime, those bits are really well written. And I really enjoyed those because I listened to the audiobook for this during October, like during Halloween time, which was a really great read to get into at that time. So I did enjoy this. Would I put it in the same category as I like this? Not necessarily, to be honest. I'm gonna put it in if you must. Because, again, I would say this is the kind of book, if you're like really into like gothic-y, like cult classic horror books or spooky books, definitely give this one a read. Otherwise, I don't think you're necessarily missing out on something here. Now we got something that's really old. Some of the oldest literature we got on this list, namely Geoffrey Chaucer. Canterbury Tales. This is how you know that I studied English, because who else really gets into the Canterbury Tales? It's also been quite a while, because you read stuff like Canterbury Tales, Baywolf, and all that in like the beginning of your studies if you study English literature. So, the Canterbury Tales is essentially like a collection of multiple like short stories, told by a group of people that are a group of pilgrims that are traveling to Canterbury Cathedral, and they're telling each other stories. Essentially, some of them are really quite interesting, some of them really funny, and this is essentially what you will hear. This is the literature you will hear about if you like really want to get into. Oh God, I'm probably gonna totally mess this up. Is this Middle English? Please God, I studied this and I don't remember. If you want to get into like Middle English literature. So this is the kind of English, linguistically speaking, that you would have a hard time understanding if you read it in the original, but would, with a lot of effort, maybe still kind of be able to understand, unlike one of the other books we're going to come to later. So this stuff is really funny, in some places really interesting, but I'm also thinking, I'm not quite sure if anyone else, apart from like really like literature nerds, would like really get into this. But then again, it's also like one of the most important texts that we have from that era, like linguistically speaking, literary speaking, which is why I also feel a bit obligated to rank this a bit higher. Because it also has, of course, a lot of historical background. So, I'm gonna say, I like this. Because, like, if you are a literature nerd, if you really want to get into, like, linguistics and all of that, this is definitely a god of literature. Like, there's no way getting past this. If you want to study, like, the history of the English language, there's no way getting past Canterbury Tales. But for a broader audience, maybe not so much, which is why it's gonna go here. Okay, next up, we got another horror classic, and we got Psycho by Robert Bloch. So Psycho When I read this for the first time, I was like 16 years old, and I had only heard of the movie. I didn't even know the Hitchcock movie was based on a book. So I saw this at my library and was like, oh, it's actually a book. Well, I'm going to read that before I watch the movie. And I haven't really reread the... No, I've reread the novel once since then, so I've read this novel twice, but it's been a while. But this is one of my favorite books I've ever read. I can't even really explain it. It's just such a well-written, horrifying piece of literature that naturally plays around with some outdated ideas surrounding mental health that do not work at all nowadays. You sort of have to keep that in mind. If you watch the movie, you also know what I'm talking about. But I don't really want to spoil it here. But if you sort of are able to look past that or accept it as a product of its time, this is such a cool and interesting story to get into, because it starts off very interestingly, like with this woman who's running away with money she's stolen from her boss, and then ends up spending the night at a motel, and the motel is occupied by this charming but very shy, slightly weird young man. And then we switch to like the perspective of Norman, who is the young man who lives there. And we quickly realize something's off about him. He likes watching the woman in the shower. He talks about like hearing the voice of his mother the whole time, sort of like the voice of reason, who always curses him for the stuff he does. And then there also seems to be another character called Normal, which seems to be a bit more like the neutral voice of reason, and he himself is sort of a very troubled young man. And then, of course, something horrible happens at the motel, and then we get the friends of the woman who stayed there trying to find out what has actually happened at the motel. And of course, then we get the reveal at the end, which I don't want to spoil, even though I'm pretty sure everyone knows. Which again, outdated, absolutely outdated nowadays. But for me, nevertheless, was so fascinating, interesting to get into that I really wanted to like watch the movie, and I even wanted to watch all the other movies. Did you know there's more than one Psycho movie? Some of them are actually good, some of them are not good at all. But to this day, Psycho has been one of my favorite horror reads. Is it a god of? To me personally, let's get a bit personal here, because I did the same thing with The Trial. To me personally, it's a god of literature. Again, naturally, subjective opinion. I don't think a lot of people would agree with me here. But definitely, if you watch the movie, if you like the movie and you haven't read the book, don't do that. You're missing out. There's like so much more detail and nuance in this book. Also, just if you want a good horror classic, I would recommend Psycho to you. Even though, again, keep in mind some outdated ideas. The book is like from the 50s, late 50s or early 60s. Keep that in mind. Next up, we got Neuromancer. Now, Neuromancer, I had to read at university as well, because I took a class on cyberpunk, and you can't get past William Gibson when you study cyberpunk. William Gibson is responsible for like basically helping to invent the genre of cyberpunk and coining so many phrases and ideas like cyberspace and all that. We get that from William Gibson. Like, there's no way getting past William Gibson if you want to get into cyberpunk, if you want to get like into inspiration for example, The Matrix and stuff like that. There's no way getting past that, especially not the book like Neuromancer. The thing is, I remember almost nothing about this book. I didn't really like it that much. There's like pages and pages of description about this man who has like cybernetic implants, and there's like a drug story going on. I can't even really tell you what is actually going on, because there's just like there was no coherent story for me in this book, and I felt, for me, the characters fell flat. It felt like, oh, cybernetic augmentations are a character trait, and I'm like, no, it's not. The thing is, I totally get why people like this book. Again, was the basis for a lot of stuff that we now associate with the cyberpunk genre. And I am thankful for the book helping to invent the cyberpunk genre. But otherwise, I don't get it, so I'm gonna say this one, really. I like some of the ideas, but the book in and of itself as a book is not even that good. Now let's jump from something about modern day, the internet, all that, to the oldest text that we will find on this list today, probably, namely Beowulf. Again, you just realize I studied English literature at some point, because who else would really get into Beowulf? Beowulf is an Old English epic poem about the hero Beowulf. It's set in what is now Scandinavia, and Beowulf is called by a king to help because the king's meat hall is being raided by a terrible monster named, I think, Grendel. It's been a while. Beowulf fights Grendel, defeats him, then we get Grendel's mom coming back for revenge. There's fight against monsters, then Beowulf fights dragons, helps the king, all that. This is like Lord of the Rings before Lord of the Rings, essentially. This is really, really interesting to get into. Obviously, this is like something you probably would not really understand if you read it in its original writing, because Old English even includes letters that the English language doesn't even have anymore, that only exist now in languages like Icelandic. So if you read this, you probably have to get a modern translation of this book. But I would urge you, if you get into Beowulf, listen to like our recordings of this on YouTube. Go and listen to a recording of people performing this epic poem in the original Old English pronunciation. It's so cool. You can definitely tell how this came from like this originally sort of like oral tradition of telling epic poetry, of telling stories like that. And similar to Canterbury Tales, this is like the one really essential text we have from that time of the English language. We don't even know who this was written by. We can't even really pinpoint when exactly this was written. We only know that it was during the time of Old English. But honestly, I think this is something people would enjoy just as much nowadays, which is why I'm going to say I'm going to put Beowulf into Gods of Literature, because so much is based on Beowulf. Also, like famous works that we know now have by authors who have studied Beowulf in the past, with then gone on to create their own stories. Like, for example, if you think about Tolkien. Tolkien was like a huge language nerd who really like studied all that stuff, and you know, was really like into Middle English and Old English and all that kind of stuff. This is the kind of stuff that Tolkien read and then based his stuff on. So I would say, yeah, God of Literature. If you really want to get like a greater understanding of what stories, especially like fantasy and adventure stories, are based on nowadays, if you just want to get like a historical understanding of the English language and of how we tell stories, read Beowulf. It's amazing. It's not even that long. And it's really, really epic and badass. Now, next up, we have our first Sherlock Holmes book. We have The Hound of the Baskervilles. The Hound of the Baskervilles is arguably the most well-known Sherlock Holmes story, which is funny because Sherlock Holmes isn't even in half the book. So this is about Watson being sent by Holmes to investigate the Baskerville family, who sort of have this curse of members of the family dying under mysterious circumstances. Now Henry Baskerville is sort of next in line, and Holmes is like, I can't leave London right now, Watson, you go and do that. And Watson's like, okay, but you're helping, right, at some point? And I think this works so well because it's just like a classic mystery. There's like a cursed family, a seeming devil dog. You're a bit worried because Watson is doing this, and we do like Watson, but he's no Holmes. So you're like, oh fuck, Watson has to do this by himself. I've always thought, well, I do enjoy Hound of the Baskervilles. I've always thought that it's a bit within the Sherlock Holmes canon, it's a little bit overrated. But I think it's a very good and classic Holmes story to get into, also if you haven't really read any Sherlock Holmes. So And also, since this channel is Sherlock Holmes Central, I can't really say that this is a bad book. So I'm gonna say, ooh, I like this. You know, we're just gonna stick with the Sherlock books real quick. Most of these are naturally short story collections. There are 4 novels in total. Next up, we got His Last Bow. This is one of the later short story collections, which includes the chronologically last Sherlock Holmes story set in 1914. It's not one of my favorite collections. It does include some, like 1 or 2 stories that I like, but they're otherwise not as important, really. Like, from this book, the only story that really stands out to me is The Dying Detective, which I quite like. I think Bruce Partington Plans is also in this, if you want to have like one of the few Mycroft stories. But those are like the only 2 stories that really stand out to me. So I'm gonna put this one in if you must, if you like really, if you really want to get into like the meat of the Sherlock Holmes canon. Valley of Fear. Valley of Fear is one of the 4 novels. The Hound of Baskers was the one, I think it was the second one. And we got Valley of Fear. I have to admit, I haven't read Valley of Fear in ages, because it seems pretty unremarkable to me. Someone who enjoys Sherlock Holmes a lot, but it's not like one of the... It's okay, but not one of the most remarkable, like, Sherlock Holmes stories. I would have to reread it to, like, really be able to like tell you what's actually going on, which is why I'm gonna put it here. Next up, we have the Casebook of Sherlock Holmes. A Casebook of Sherlock Holmes was the last collection of short stories that came out, but is chronologically set before His Last Bow. To me personally, this is the worst one collection-wise. Like, none of the Holmes stories are like straight up terrible, but to me, there's only really one story that stands out to me in this entire collection, namely The Illustrious Client, which is one of my favorite Sherlock Holmes stories, actually. Otherwise, I'm gonna say this one, really. Could have done better, Arthur. Could have done better. Quickly, next up, The Return of Sherlock Holmes. This is the Sherlock Holmes short story collection that came out before His Last Bow. Features, naturally, the return of Sherlock Holmes, because is that even a spoiler? He dies at some point in the canon, and everyone hated Sir Arthur Conan Doyle so much, he was like, okay, I'm bringing him back. So that's how we got this collection. Naturally, this is like one where you get The Empty House, which is the story where Holmes comes back. A story that's quite good, actually. Here on the cover we see The Dancing Men, which is also a story that's quite well renowned and good. This is one of the short story collections I enjoy a bit more. I think you can't go wrong with this one, which is why I'm going to say, ooh, I like this. Then we have, the next Sherlock Holmes book is The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, which is the one that came out before The Return of Sherlock Holmes. This one I think is also pretty solid. Naturally, since it came out before The Return of Sherlock Holmes, this is the story that features the Reichenbach Fall, the final problem, the one where Sherlock Holmes finally fights against Moriarty on page, which automatically makes this a good book. I think this also includes The Greek Interpreter, which is another Mycroft story. Mycroft stories are always fun. Silver Blaze, I think, is also in this, which is a story I also quite enjoy, about a racehorse, a story I actually quite like so much that I once tried to write fanfiction about it. Like BBC Sherlock fanfiction based on that one. So I'm gonna say, ooh, I like this. This is also a short story collection you can't really go wrong with in regards to Sherlock Holmes. Now we got the first ever Sherlock Holmes novel, the first ever Sherlock Holmes story, The Sign of Four. Now, I wouldn't say that I wouldn't even say that The Sign of Four is necessarily a better novel than The Hound of the Baskervilles. But the thing is, The Sign of Four introduced the world to Sherlock Holmes and to Dr. Watson, to the character, to the whole shtick of Holmes and Watson, to the archetype that is Sherlock Holmes, because he is in and of himself a archetype for the weird detective. a very clever detective. The thing is, first half of this novel, great, solving the case with Holmes and Watson, it's all a bit weird and mysterious. Then the second half is a good chunk of the perpetrator telling us his background story, and it's a lot about him being in America and about how Mormons were being really awful and weird to him and his girlfriend, and it's very awkward to read nowadays. I think Sir Arthur Conan Doyle even himself later said that he wouldn't depict Mormons like that now. So that's like the only like really big flaw that this novel has. Nevertheless, I'm gonna say God of Literature literally came up with one of the most well-renowned literary characters of all time. A character who's so well known, I think he's the one fictional character that has been adapted the most out of all the other ones, and just introduce the world to one of the most iconic characters of fiction. And last off, we have the first short story collection. We got The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. No questions asked, I'm going to put this one in Gods of Literature as well. This is my favorite collection of short stories from the Sherlock Holmes canon. Purely also based because it has like some... The first story in this is A Scandal in Bohemia. Like the story that introduces Irene Adler. And I think Solitary Cyclist is also in this one. Red-Headed League, 5 Orange Pips. I think Speckled Band is also in this, which I think Sir Arthur Conan Doyle himself said is the best Sherlock Holmes story. You get all of these banger stories in this one collection, which to me makes it the best Sherlock Holmes collection, and definitely like this is the must read. If you read one novel and one Sherlock Holmes collection, read Adventures of Sherlock Holmes for the short stories, and read Study in Scarlet for the novels, and maybe also Hound of the Baskers if you want. Now let's continue over here. Here we have, a quite well-known classic. We got Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and I think this is no question if I say this is one of the best books and most interesting books ever written. This book not only is it like a great sort of like early 19th century romantic gothic-y kind of novel, this is also a novel that just helped to invent the science fiction genre as we know it now. Like this is prototype science fiction at its best. It's about like man playing God. It's about humanity. Can humanity itself create other humanity? How responsible is Frankenstein really for his own creation? Is the monster even really the monster? You know, the story, the most popular interpretation is that Frankenstein's the actual monster of this book, for good reason, actually, if you read it. And I think this book's just so iconic, and it's so well written, so engaging. I remember when this was one of the books I read during my studies, and I remember when we discussed this book in class, and we read out loud. I think I actually had to do that. Read the passage of the monster waking up for the first time. It's so chilling and so well written. You can just taste the tension as you read the words. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. And what I think is also interesting about this book, it's written in a way that I don't think a lot of people really realize, like how it works. It's a bit like an onion, because we do have frame narratives within this book. So it starts off, I think, quite differently than maybe most people who are not familiar with this book would expect, because it starts out with Frankenstein like on a ship in the Arctic trying to find his monster, and the captain is like, well, what are you doing here? What happened? Then Frankenstein goes on to dive into the story about who he is, where does he come from, how did he come up with the idea to create the monster, and then within that, the monster starts telling us about his story, and then it's sort of like layers. It's like Inception. And that's sort of how this works, which I think makes this, it's just one of the many points why this novel fascinates people until this very, very day, and is definitely something that is worth checking out by anyone who ever wants to read a good book about just like the major nature of man. Next up, we have another book that's a bit older. We got Morris by E.M. Forster. Morris was written by E.M. Forster in the early 20th century, I think around 1914, 1917, I'm not quite sure, but wasn't published until after his death. I think it was published in the 70s, because Morris tells the story of a young homosexual man at university and how he grew up as a kid, knowing that or feeling that he's a bit different compared to all the other boys that he hangs out with. And at college, at university, he for the first time in his life starts meeting other people, other men who are like him. And it's like a coming of age story. Then he sort of comes to realize who he really is, and the story of his life sort of told by two romances. Like first off with the young student that he gets to know at university, who then later goes on a very different path compared to him, whereas Morris develops, his first love seems to go from like a very free-spirited kind of individual to a more closed-off individual. And Morris instead moves on and then meets, I think it's the gardener of who works for his like first boyfriend, essentially, and he's the one who helps Morris really truly realize that this is who he is, this is what he wants, this is what he deserves this love in his life. And I know this is I know this is a spoiler if I tell you this, but I think this is important to know. This is a novel from the gay novel from the early 20th century, and it has a happy ending. It has a happy ending. It just ends with Morris and the gardener hanging out in the woods, like just being happy together, which is quite nice. So I'm gonna put this into. Ooh, I like this because I honestly think this is essential, like 20th century, not only like just like general lit fig literature you should read, literary fiction literature. What did I just say? It is a book I think you should definitely check out, especially if you're like into queer literature, historical literature. Also, I think it's written in a very beautiful, almost like flowery, very prosaic kind of style, which I really, really love to read, which I can see not everyone maybe really likes. Sometimes it was a bit hard to follow what was actually going on, but nevertheless, it's just the kind of language you read where you're like, I just love getting into this. So that's what we're going with. Let's stick with over here. We got a modern classic. We got The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. Now, it's been a while since I've read The Hunger Games. I rewatched the movies more often. I think I've only really read the trilogy once, and it's been quite a while. However, it cannot be denied what kind of impact The Hunger Games had on not just the YA genre in general, but on literature as a whole, because it just like started an entire boom of dystopian literature, like just popping up everywhere. Naturally, it includes ideas that aren't necessarily new. You know, Battle Royale, all of that has been done before. But I think Hunger Games really brought this idea to like the Western audience and really like perfected it, especially like for a younger audience, because it's not just about teenagers killing each other. It's also about class and status and elitism, and the violence in this book is used to like actually explore like those topics and the society Katniss lives in. Like Hunger Games really got what it was going for, and unlike so many other books that it later inspired, who just included violence because Hunger Games did, but they didn't really understand why Hunger Games had the violence, what it was using it for, like what kind of point it was trying to make with that. So I will say, I'm probably going to put this in Gods of Literature because while this might not have been one of the best books or best YA books I've ever read, this book was so fundamentally important for the impact that it had on YA literature and also literature as a whole, because it like just influenced popular mainstream literature for a good while. it was really hard to ignore, and I think even now we still feel the impact of the original Hunger Games trilogy, which is why, which is why I think it deserves to be there as a modern classic. Now let's jump into some Shakespeare. I already mentioned a bit of a Shakespeare nerd, so obviously there are many Shakespeare plays. Maybe I'm even going to do a ranking one day of ranking all the plays, which would be fun, I think. So for this list, I chose like I don't know, I think four or five of his most well-known plays, the ones that like really everyone knows from school or just via cultural osmosis. And we're starting off with Hamlet. And I mean, I already mentioned earlier, Hamlet's literally my favorite play of all time. Hamlet, god of literature. Hamlet is like the story of all stories. If it's only one Shakespeare story you will ever read in your entire life, please make it Hamlet. Hamlet is great. Hamlet is so great. I've watched like a bajillion different versions of this wherever I could. Whenever I find a version of this online, or someone puts up like a recording of a Hamlet production, I will watch it. I get super duper excited when one of my favorite actors gets to play Hamlet. I'm super excited when like in the town where I live someone puts on Hamlet. I will go and watch that. Have I read and seen the story like 30 times? Yes, but I can't get enough of it. There's always something new with the story. This is a very long play. I think this is Shakespeare's longest play. I'm not even quite sure if ever like a full-on production has ever been made, like really unedited, the entire script of Hamlet. Because I think if you were to like put this on stage unedited, this would last for like 4, 5, 6 hours. It's like you could make a mini-series out of this essentially. The thing is, I know some people make fun of some people like to make fun of it, being like, oh, why doesn't Hamlet like kill his uncle immediately after he finds out that his uncle killed his dad? I'm like, that's not the point. The point is that Hamlet is conflicted about his mission. It's about the question, is he really mad? Is he just pretending to be mad? Because Hamlet is going through a lot of psychological shit. Hamlet is like the original depressed, melancholic main character. Hamlet is the archetype for that. Hamlet invented that shit. Like I wrote an entire paper during my study days on melancholia melancholy and depression in Hamlet, which was one of my favorite essays to work on during my study days. There are just so many aspects and nuances, not just to only Hamlet the character, but to literally every single character and to the entire story. Always something new to discover. I could go on. I want to go on. But we've got so many other books to talk about. God of literature, best play that's ever been written. Period. Shakespeare's best work. If it's only one Shakespeare play you ever read, please make it this one. Next up, we got another Shakespeare play. Like we said, I'm gonna do some Shakespeare. Next up, we got Macbeth. Macbeth is another one of my favorite Shakespeare plays because I just love a good, brutal, violent story about a man breaking down because he fucked up. So Macbeth obviously sort of has a bit of a historical background, but it's mostly because, Queen Elizabeth was like, can you write something about the Scottish but make it like really bad because the Scottish people suck? And Shakespeare was like, yeah, sure, I'm gonna write you something. And then Macbeth happened. Macbeth, I think, is really interesting about getting into like, the fate and the fortune of men. Like, how much do you like really form your own path in life? Because Macbeth is being told by the three witches, who of course are iconic, that he will become king of I want to say king of Denmark, but that's Hamlet, king of Scotland. And he's like, what? Really? Are you sure about that? And he tells his wife, and his wife is like, you have to make that happen. And in a way, I mean, Lady Macbeth in and of herself is like a quite interesting character. Sort of coerces and talks Macbeth into doing this, and Macbeth is ends up killing the king of Scotland to become king himself, but then it ends up Game of Thrones style murdering so many other people just so he can keep the secret that he was responsible for the death of the king, and mentally absolutely spirals. I mean, he spirals from the beginning of the play, you could argue. But once he's killed the king and his hands are like covered in blood, and he's even so confused and concerned by what he's done, he even forgets to like throw away the murder weapon, or even before that starts to imagine daggers in the air. That this play just becomes a very interesting character study of a man completely broken by his own actions, who just like keeps spiraling, who tries to outdo the consequences are inevitably coming to get him. And he constantly tries to make up for what he's done, but he can't. Like, he's fucked up, and he just keeps fucking up until the consequences get him and the people around him. And again, is this God? Yes, I'm gonna say God of Literature. It's one of my favorite Shakespeare plays of all time. It's also one of those plays that I love to come back to. If you don't want to read it but want to watch a really cool, accurate version of it, go and watch the Michael Fassbender Macbeth movie. It's such a gorgeous looking movie, also like with the original Macbeth script. Go like these two are like really essential Shakespeare reading if you like really want to get back really want to get into Shakespeare. Something if you want something a bit more psychological and violent, I could definitely recommend this one. Let's jump to the next Shakespeare play. We go Romeo and Juliet. The funny thing is, Romeo and Juliet in school was the first Shakespeare play I ever read, and I hated it. But that was because I was 12. I was 12 and forced to read Shakespeare. And then it was a romance story, and I've never really enjoyed romance stories, even though it's a tragic romance story. And I was like, I hate this, and I don't understand what they're saying because the language is weird, because that's what Shakespeare's like to you when you're 12. Actually, I hated it so much that I wrote a parody, like a parody play of Romeo and Juliet to make fun of it. Don't know if I still got that somewhere. Romeo and Juliet is okay. Bit overrated in my opinion. Naturally, it's a very well-known tragedy, like a romance tragedy. The age gap between the two main characters is very weird when you read it now. I get why it's so well beloved, because, you know, star-crossed lovers and all that. People love each other, doomed to die. A love that's doomed to fail, essentially. But I'm gonna say, if you must. Honestly, it's not the first Shakespeare play I would recommend to anyone that comes to mind. Not even like one of the, if you want to read tragedy, go and read this one. Not necessarily. This one really, if you want to get the essential Shakespeare's, yeah, you could read that, but you honestly don't have to. Let's jump to Midsummer Night's Dream. Midsummer Night's Dream is arguably the most well-known comedy play by Shakespeare. I can totally see why. There's so much wacky shit and shenanigans that go on in this book. Like people falling in love with the wrong people, people ending up with literal donkey heads and then shagging the Queen of Fairies. That is stuff that actually happens. And it's funny. It's hilarious. If you watch a production of this, I think reading it is not the same as watching it. Like with Hamlet and Macbeth, it's really interesting to read them. You don't necessarily have to watch them, but with Midsummer Night's Dream, as is the case with most comedies, you really have to go and watch a production of it, because this shit is so hilarious when you got a company, like a group of people who like really get down with like the characters and are willing to like do a bit of weird shit. This is really funny. It has also like so much potential for like queer coded like storytelling and characters. So I'm gonna say, I like this, because this definitely, I'm normally not vibing that well with Shakespeare's comedies, but it's one of Shakespeare's like most essential plays for a reason. So really, if you do want to get into like Shakespeare and the comedies, yeah, you can't go wrong with Midsummer Night's Dream. So let's continue with King Lear. King Lear is more one of the tragedies, but like a bit of a historic touch about an old king and his daughters, which is one of the plays I actually read for the first time like 2 years ago or something. I watched I think there's a brilliant movie with Anthony Hopkins and Andrew Scott, with actually Anthony Hopkins as King Lear, which was quite good. And I think King Lear is quite interesting as another more like of a character study. on who King Lear is, on masculinity especially, which I thought was quite interesting, on how he sees himself, how he sees monarchy, how he sees women, what's his relationship with his daughter like, and all that. I would argue, because I know it's one of the most well-known ones, but I think it's a tiny bit underrated maybe. So I'm gonna say, I like this. I think this is really interesting. It's another great monarch character study from Shakespeare. I think you can really get your teeth into and find something really interesting here. Next up, let's do some Agatha Christie. We have The Mousetrap. The Mousetrap is the longest running play of all time. And I'm not kidding here, literally of all time. The Mousetrap, I don't want to say too much about because we all know the ending is a secret. The Mousetrap is a classic Agatha Christie whodunit. It's about a group of people that are snowed in at a big house, at a mansion. A murder occurs. There's a detective who comes there to solve it, but people keep dying, and then at the end we get a reveal on who did it. And actually, if you go watch this play, which I really want to do if I ever get the chance, if you watch this play, the group of actors at the end will tell the audience, please do not tell anyone what you have witnessed here today, and do not spoil the ending for anyone, because the ending of the story is quite well known, it's quite notorious, it's a big plot twist, and I really like this one. I honestly really like it. I think it's one of them. I think it's the longest running play for a very good reason. And Agatha Christie's like the king of whodunits, like the king of the queen, rather, of course, the queen of whodunits, the queen of crime stories. And if you ever watch a play that's more of a crime story, you have to go watch this one. You just have to, even if you just read it, it's so much fun to get into, just like a good classic whodunit. And it's one of the whodunits you just have to check out in your life, honestly. It's just that fun, that interesting to get into. Even if nowadays you could maybe, of course, sort of guess where the twist is going, I still think it works nevertheless. And it's quite a good, like a fun tradition, I think. Next up with Agatha Christie, we have Murder on the Orient Express, which is arguably the number one Agatha Christie novel, the number one Poirot story. We all know the story. Poirot boards the Orient Express. A murder happens on the Orient Express. The express is snowed in. No one can go anywhere, and the only person who is there to solve the crime is Poirot himself. So he goes and investigates the crime, which then is revealed to have been perpetrated by, and that's a secret. I think it's a well-known secret. Who the perpetrator turns out to be. A twist which I nevertheless really like. And I'm a big fan of Poirot. While I do like Miss Marple, I've always enjoyed Poirot more. Because Poirot is very much like this classic idea of a smart, slightly odd, maybe a bit exotic kind of detective, also of course similarly styled to Sherlock Holmes. And I would say, if you do read a Poirot story, yes, it's Murder on the Orient Express. If it's only one Poirot story you ever read, make it Murder on the Orient Express. It's a classic for a reason, to be honest. And Agatha Christie is just so good at writing her whodunits. The only ever real problem I have with Agatha Christie books is that she has usually a huge cast of characters, and they all read sort of the same, and you have trouble really connecting with any of them and distinguishing them within the narrative. That's sort of the only problem I really have with her books. So I would argue, for me, it's somewhere between God of Literature and I like this. But considering that Agatha Christie is so well known, and she's the queen of crime literature, she has created characters and elements of this genre that we know until this very day. She's the one who really made whodunits what they are now. So I think it's only fair if we put this here. If you ever read like one Agatha Christie novel, you just can't go wrong with this one. Unlike, and here we have a bit of a controversial opinion from me, and then there were None, which is one of the best-selling novels of all time. And I'm gonna be honest and say it's probably gonna go in this one. Really? Because, well, I do think it's interesting, and it's a well-written book. I just think Agatha Christie has written so much more interesting, well-written stuff. This doesn't feature any of like her known detectives. This is not a Poirot story, not a Miss Marple story. It's a story about a bunch of people who are called to an island for they don't know what reason, and then people are starting to be killed off one by one until hopefully the murders are resolved, or until everyone on the island is dead. Again, there's a bit of a twist at the end there when it's revealed who organized this whole thing and who committed the murders. An ending you can sort of see coming a bit. And honestly, to me, this didn't really... Like, I like Agatha Christie, I like reading her books, but to me, this also has the same problems again I usually have with her books. It's a huge cast of characters. I don't know who any of them are. I don't connect with any of them because they all sort of read the same. They all have the same narrative voice. I have no idea who is who. I don't really care who dies and who lives. Since there is no really enigmatic detective person like in Poirot or Miss Marple, I don't really have anyone I want to follow. The only sort of thing that keeps me going is that I want to have the reveal at the end who actually did all of this. And when you get to it, you're like, you're either gonna be like, oh really? Really? Like that's what we're doing? Like, really? Okay, I guess. And I don't know. So for me, this is, I think, rather controversially gonna go in this one. Really? This is one of the most most sold novels of all time. The best-selling novel of all time. Really, this one. Because I don't know. There's just other stuff, especially from Christie, that I thought deserves this much more. I just realized I made two terrible mistakes. The first one, I paused the recording and then forgot to hit record again, so I have to repeat like 20 minutes of footage for the next couple of books, just in case you're wondering why I might sound a little annoyed. And we're starting off with the second mistake I just noticed, which is that I messed up some books. So the mistake I noticed was, earlier when we were talking about Sherlock Holmes books, I picked up The Sign of 4 and not A Study in Scotland, because for some reason I thought this was Study in Scotland. I don't know, maybe because the covers looked similar. So obviously I talked about Study in Scarlet before, so I'm not repeating that here. We're putting this one, the correct book, up here where I said it would go. And let's quickly talk about The Sign of 4. The Sign of 4 is the second ever Sherlock Holmes book, Sherlock Holmes novel, which is famous for introducing the character of Mary Morstan, who of course by the end of the book goes on to fall in love with Watson and eventually they get married. And she's like one of the only like 2 or 3 like really female characters by name that we get that reoccur occasionally. The Sign of 4 is alright, it's fun. It's like a good classic, not necessarily whodunit, but like a mystery. You know, Mary goes to visit Holmes and Watson about like something that happened to her family or their father. Like there's like some sort of secret treasure going on. It's honestly been a while since I've read this. But it's a solid story. I think one that you have to read if you get into the canon. So it's one I reread more often than some other Sherlock Holmes stories. So I'm gonna put this in, ooh, I like this. And then we're gonna move on to some fantasy. So first up, we have the one and only Game of Thrones. Okay, so everyone knows Game of Thrones, right? And just like a lot of other people, I was a big fan of the TV show, and then I decided to read the books, and I have to admit that At the time when the TV show was still good, obviously, I was like, I'm actually enjoying. I think the TV show is better than the books. I read like I think 2 books of the original series. I'm not even quite sure if I finished the second one, which is why only the first one is on here. And I can totally see why people like Game of Thrones as a book. Like, it's very classic, like big, epic fantasy. However, it's very low on the fantasy elements, much more concerned with like the socio-political intrigue of the world. And the fantasy stuff is sort of more going on in the background. It's really more about like, the character work and all that. And for me, from what I remember, it was very tedious to read because it has very long chapters, a lot of talking. It's slow. It's sort of like the first couple of seasons of the TV show. You really have to like spend some time to get into it. And the problem with the book is when you get to like a POV chapter from a character you just don't enjoy, it's really hard to like stick with the story to get back into it. Which is why I had a lot of like breaks and eventually stopped reading the series altogether, because there would just be chapters where I was like, oh no, now we got another Brennan chapter. Oh, now we got another John chapter. I don't want to read that for 30 pages. And then it's just sort of hard to keep going. Again, I can totally see why people like this. Of course, this reads a little bit like the American version of Lord of the Rings, a little bit, but with a more of a historic touch to everything else. And I totally get why people are into this. Like, I was a big fan of the TV show back in the day. However, like I said, I didn't really enjoy the book or books, 2 books, that much. So I'm gonna be a bit harsh. Normally it would be in like somewhere between these two, but I'm gonna be a bit harsh because I honestly would necessarily recommend. I'm not even quite sure if I would recommend the book to people who are fans of the show, because it's a bit of a slog fest to get through, to be honest. So while reading, I was a bit like, this one, really? That's what was the base for this really great TV show? Really? Okay. So I don't know. That's where we ended up, I guess. Next up, let's talk about a book by one of my favorite authors of all time. Let's talk about American Gods by Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman is my favorite contemporary author, like as an author who's still alive and writes books. And I have to admit, I'm not the biggest fan of American Gods. I love all of Neil Gaiman's works somehow. Like, he's never really written anything straight up bad or anything that I really hated. But American Gods was the one I read where I was like, I'm not really getting into it that much. So I really like the general premise about the book, that it's about that gods have like personifications depending on where people worship them. So you have this premise of like the old gods having personifications of them in like the United States or something, but there are also new gods being created by the belief of the people who now start to believe in other things. Like, media, television, stuff like that. So new gods are starting to like sort of take over and push out the old gods. And we throw in this human character called Shadow, who becomes a driver for one of the old gods. And then we sort of go in this American road trip, basically, and discover a bunch of other gods, new and old. And I just didn't vibe with it that much. The joke about this is that people who have read other works by Neil Gaiman, the joke is usually that people who like American Gods don't like Neverwhere as much, or people who like Neverwhere don't like American Gods as much. And somehow that's actually kind of true, because Neverwhere is my favorite Neil Gaiman novel. It's one of my favorite novels of all time. And then I look at American Gods and I'm like, I don't get it. Like, it disappoints me, but because it's like really, really long. It's like a really long road trip. That for me just didn't have enough excitement, not enough of an interesting exploration of the general premise that I really wanted to keep going. I mean, of course I finished it, but I barely remember anything. I read it like 5 or 6 years ago. And the only thing I remember is that I got bored and I just wanted to be done with it. But it did have interesting elements that I liked. So and I also know that there's a TV show based on the book, which I think people like. So I'm not quite sure. It's somewhere between If You Must and this one, really. Um, I would say I probably enjoyed it a bit more than these books, like in the this one really category. So let's put it for here. But it's like honestly, it's not the first Neil Gaiman novel I would recommend to anyone. I would say read American Gods if you've read like 2 or 3 other novels by Neil Gaiman, and then go and try reading American Gods. Next up, we have a classic dystopian book, namely Brave New World. I had to read this one for university as well, because I attended a class on alternate history stories on dystopias, that kind of stuff, sort of like Elseworld stories, that kind of thing. And Brave New World was one by Aldous Huxley, was one of the books we had to read, and I remember that I didn't really like it all that much. I think it had some interesting aspects with, the world state and people who live within that state, but also people who live outside of that, sort of like in a colony state, removed from everyone else. Sort of like, have we perfect humanity? What about drugs, feelings, and all that? The way in which children are produced within the world, femininity, and like women are being treated, and equality has been achieved. It has some interesting aspects that I thought were interesting, but overall, I don't think this book works as well anymore, and I don't necessarily would recommend. I don't really would recommend this for someone who wants to get into like dystopian or what if stories, because I'm a big fan of like what if stories. One of my favorite genres to read. I eventually, I even end up writing like my master's thesis on alternate history because of that seminar. But Brave New World really wasn't it, and I don't even remember that much stuff that happened that I really liked, and it made me more uncomfortable than I really enjoyed it. So, while not as bad as The Trial, I think I'm gonna put it here because I don't really understand why this should be the one book you read on dystopian literature. Like, unless you're like really, really into like that specific premise, I don't necessarily would get into this one. Next up, let's talk some Tolkien, and we're starting off with The Hobbit, because of course we have to talk Tolkien. I read The Hobbit. I actually read The Hobbit after I read Lord of the Rings. So I read The Hobbit for the first time when I was like 14, 15 years old, I think. I know this is more of a kid's story, but I think this nevertheless works for both adults and kids alike. This really just reads like a fun adventure story about a little guy who meets a wizard and then a bunch of dwarves, and then they just go on a fun fantasy adventure. This reads like a D&D campaign, essentially, because the story is very episodic. It's about like those dwarves trying to reclaim their homeland. There's a dragon who, of course, seems very mysterious and dangerous. There's Gollum, like a weird little creature that tells Bilbo riddles. And there's stuff in there that I think is really interesting and fun, especially if you're like a kid, because it's really just like woo, fun adventure. But also just world building wise, I think there's a lot of stuff going on, like with Erebor and Smaug. Especially, I really like Smaug as a character. Like this whole scene with him and Bilbo talking in the mountain is quite interesting. I think some stuff I thought could have been elaborated a bit more on, like this whole thing with the 5 armies. In the book is like 2 or 3 pages, then Bilbo passes out and he wakes up and the battle is over. And yeah, turns out somehow you can make a 3-hour movie out of that, which wasn't necessary. But also, again, in the book it's like not that big of a thing, and some of the characters definitely are not that detailed at all. Like, it's really just about Bilbo, Gandalf, and like Thorin a little bit. So it's much more just about like the fun of adventure, but that like despite all those little flaws, The Hobbit is still a fantastic story for kids and adults alike, and it's the kind of book I would like maybe one day read to my nieces and nephews or something. Which is why this goes in. Ooh, I like this. And of course, let's immediately talk about Lord of the Rings. Okay, so Lord of the Rings. I read for the first time, I think, when I was around 12 or 13 years old. Like, it was one of the first books or book series I read, like one of the first major book series I read. Because I started out like really with fantasy, and then I saw the movies and I really enjoyed them. I was like, oh, of course I have to read the books now. And Lord of the Rings is gonna go in. I'm gonna put it there in a minute. Of course, it's gonna go into literature. God, like Lord of the Rings is the fantasy book. And while Tolkien didn't necessarily invent the fantasy genre, because of course there's some other authors who did fantastical stuff before him, his works, especially Lord of the Rings, influenced the fantasy genre until this very day. Like elements, characteristics, and concepts he came up with and put into the Lord of the Rings books have had a long-lasting impact on the fantasy genre as a whole, regardless of which part of fantasy you look at. Everything, almost everything that we now associate with fantasy, with the genre, took some kind of inspiration from Tolkien, especially from Lord of the Rings. Stuff like D&D is basically Lord of the Rings but playable. And I will say I can totally understand if some people are like, oh, this is just walking. Yes, there is a lot of walking. Like I'm like rereading the Lord of the Rings books at the moment. I recently finished Fellowship, and yes, the first half of Fellowship is literally just the hobbits getting to Rivendell. That's the entire first half of the book, and then the second half is a bit more exciting with like the Fellowship going out to destroy the ring. But the way it's written is just masterfully crafted. It's crafted with such an attention to detail and love. Like you can really tell this man, who had such a love for language and fantasy and culture, put so much love and effort into this world. Like this man came up with like a bunch of fantasy languages and cultures and songs, and then he was like, "Oh, cool! I've come up with all these cool language things. I have to write a book about them now, so I can put them somewhere." And that's how Lord of the Rings was made. Um, and yes, it is a bit old-fashioned, especially if you compare to like modern-day fantasy, like contemporary fantasy. This will not probably be everyone's cup of tea, especially if you compare like Lord of the Rings with fantasy that's really popular now. It's not the same, but even like the like contemporary popular fantasy right now has, in some way, shape, or form, definitely been influenced by Lord of the Rings, and it's it's simply a fantasy masterpiece. If you really want to get to the true roots, the true heart of fantasy, you have to read Lord of the Rings. There's no way around it. Yes, I will understand if some people say it's a bit tedious to get through. I totally get you. There's a lot of walking. There's a lot of singing. It feels all very old-fashioned, and it has a very much sort of an old-fashioned fairy tale vibe. I mean, these books like The Hobbit, and they're all like from the first half of the 20th century. Of course, they're written a bit differently. Like the language is a bit different. But again, even that is an aspect that has persisted into like our modern day understanding of fantasy, that we're sort of thinking, oh, it has to be a bit medieval and a bit old-fashioned. Like I could talk for hours about Lord of the Rings, of course. But for now, let's just say God of Literature, one of the best books, if not even the best fantasy book ever written. And that's why it belongs into the category of gods of literature. Now, let's talk some Jules Verne, actually. So, Jules Verne, 19th century French author, is basically one of the founding fathers of like modern sci-fi stories, and especially like sci-fi-esque adventure stories. Here we got Around the World in 80 Days, which isn't that heavy on the sci-fi elements, but it certainly feels very fantastical. So it's about a man who takes the bet that he can travel around the world in 80 days, and he does that along with his servant, butler, who helps him to get around the world in 80 days. Along the way, they have a couple of adventures. They meet interesting people, discover new cultures, and pick up a nice lady who sort of falls in love with the main character. It's not really explained that well. It's a 19th century adventure story. Jules Verne is just like so great to read. We're gonna come to Journey to the Center of the Earth in a minute, but I got into Jules Verne because Brendan Fraser was in a movie about Journey to the Center of the Earth. And I was such a huge fan of Brendan Fraser in that movie. I was like, that was the reason why I got into Jules Verne. And Around the World in 80 Days, I think, is such a classic adventure story that everyone can just have fun with. Don't expect like too much detailed characterization and all that. This is really just about having a fun, fantastical adventure, like really sort of a Victorian idea of going on a big expedition around the world, discovering exotic countries, seeing elephants, rescuing the damsel in distress, and then about, manhood and all that, the excitement of adventure. It's all about that. There's also a fun mini-series that came out not too long ago with starring David Tennant that covers this book in a more or less faithful adaptation. So yeah, Around the World in 80 Days. Very fun story. And I'm gonna say it's maybe somewhere between I like it and if you must. I'm gonna put it here because I think, especially if you get into like Jules Verne, this is like one of the stories you definitely will have to check out. And another one of those stories is, I already mentioned it, Journey to the Center of the Earth. Like I said, I discovered this book because of the movie, and I just love this book. This, even more than Around the World in 80 Days, is like the classic early sci-fi-esque fantastical adventure story that you know from that time period. I just imagine how amazing this sounds. That you have like a young student and then this professor, and they assemble like a team of travelers, and they go to Iceland, to a place that actually exists in real life, and that's where they find the entry into the center of the earth. And they travel down there amongst like dangerous terrain and animals, and then they discover there's like this huge, almost paradise like place within the core of the earth, which is filled like with a jungle, beautiful forests, an entire ocean, dinosaurs. It's just like the ideal idea of the classic fantastical adventure story. And especially if you want to get into Jules Verne, it's like one of the novels you have to read by him. Like, this story was so influential that some people even thought that that was a thing that could actually be real. Like, Hollow Earth, and he could travel down there and have adventures. Naturally, unfortunately, not true. But nevertheless, this is also a bit of personal bias. I'm gonna put it in God of Literature, like Literature God, because this is just like such a fun adventure story. It's like what introduced me to like all this 19th century fantastical storytelling. And if you want to just get into like not just a fun adventure story, but like Jules Verne as an author, who I think is quite well known and rightly so regarded as one of the best writers, definitely you have to check out Journey to the Center of the Earth. And we'll move on to a book that's actually quite similar, by an author we've already encountered. We're going to talk about Lost World by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So this one I read because I was like, well, I know that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle has written other stories that are not Sherlock Holmes, and I want to see, can he actually write anything else that's not Sherlock Holmes? Is he actually a good writer and not just a good detective story writer? And I can tell you, yes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is actually a good writer. The Lost World is very similar to the Jules Verne 19th century fantastical adventure stories with a bit of a sci-fi element. The Lost World is about a group of people led by Professor Challenger, who Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a whole series about, and they travel to what is like a lost plateau somewhere in the world that no one has ever found before. There they encounter strange human ape-like beings, dinosaurs, new creatures, or creatures that everyone thought were extinct. So very similar sort of in vibe to Journey to the Center of the Earth. And I think this is another one of like just those classic adventure stories that you can have a lot of fun with. And naturally, keep in mind this was written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, namely a white man from Britain from the 19th century. So there are some elements in here that have not aged well at all, especially when it comes to them meeting like the sort of the indigenous people of the plateau and all that. Yeah, you have to look a bit past that if you read it, or see it like in the context of its time. Also, like some very early movies exist as an adaptation of this book. If you ever want to get into like early, very, very, very early movie adaptations. Well, I wouldn't necessarily regard this as highly as Jules Verne. This is still very much in the same vein. It's still very well written. Like Professor Challenger, the character is very different to Sherlock Holmes. Like you can tell that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle just wanted to do something differently. And I think you can have a lot of fun with this. I'm gonna I want to say, I mean, I did enjoy it, but I don't think it's quite up there with those books. So I'm gonna put it in if you must, but as a really positive recommendation if you really want to get into like more classic adventure stories, like sort of Jules Verne kind of stories. Now, let's talk about another favorite of mine. Let's talk about Papillon. Now, I'm not even quite sure if this is considered classic. I wasn't quite sure if I should put it here, but I really like this book. I read this 3 or 4 years ago after watching the newer movies. There's 2 movies based on this book. And I watched the newer one with Charlie Hunnam and Rami Malek. I've also watched the older one since then. Was fascinated by the movie and wanted to read the book because this book is based on true events. I'm going to come back to that. It's based on, so Henri Charrier, I hope I pronounced this right. So Papillon, which was his nickname, was a man that existed in real life, and he was imprisoned in, I think, the early half of the 20th century. And he was sent to one of the penal colonies that France had, which was South America, and he had to work there in this awful prison. And this book describes his day-to-day life there, that he had to live through for a large chunk of his life. He describes the day-to-day life, what it was like to work in the prison, what daily routine was like, what people did to survive, like really awful things, what they did to each other, what they did to themselves, just to have a minimum amount of comfort in any way, shape, or form, because the way in which those prisoners were kept in those prison colonies overseas was absolutely awful, like really absolutely awful. And Papillon tried multiple times to escape from the prison. And every time he didn't succeed, he was sent to like an even worse overseas prison, which was basically like the neighbor prison, which was even worse because it basically meant stuff like solitary confinement for several years, like up to 5 or 10 years of solitary confinement, what was stuff he had to go through. And he survived and still tried to make the best of the situation, still tried to escape. And not even a spoiler, just because the story is so amazing. Eventually, he does manage to escape. In a truly like horrendous, epic adventure, he manages to escape overseas with like boats and stuff he builds himself along with other friends, along with other prisoners, and manages to escape to another nearby country where he's allowed to go free. And the point, until you get to that book, is honestly truly filled with amazing stories. Obviously, it has been questioned a couple of times how much of that book is actually real, how much has actually happened to Papillon, how much did he just come up with, how much is stuff that happened to other people. But there's a nice quote in one of the 2 movies where the character of Papillon in the movie says, this isn't the story of one man, it's the story of many men. And that's sort of how you have to see this book. That yes, I mean, the man existed, some of the stuff happened to him. Maybe not everything, but some of that stuff did happen to some people who were there. And he is telling us about that stuff. And it was truly amazing. Like, just also gut-wrenching and honestly emotional and beautiful to some degree, because sometimes you would read about Papillon trying to escape and encountering people who, just from the goodness of their heart, helped him, just because they wanted to, just because they knew where he came from what kind of awful place he came from, and they were willing to help him. Of course, there are also some people who are just awful, who were like, we're not going to help you because you're from a prison, and if you don't give us money, we don't help you. But there will always be moments in the story where like, this is so mind-blowingly amazing and gut-wrenching that this truly happened in some way, shape, or form. I could talk about this for a long time, but definitely God of literature. It's one of the greatest books I've ever read that's based on a true story. I know there's a second book as well where he talks about his life after prison that I still really, really want to read. But honestly, if you maybe only know one of the movies and have never read the book, please, I can only urge you to go and read this book. It's truly an amazing account of a hard life. Next up, we have a book I think that's also pretty well known. We got Orlando by Virginia Woolf. I think this is the only Virginia Woolf book I've ever read so far. I need to read more by Virginia Woolf. I also don't really remember that much about it, to be honest. So Orlando is the story about a young man who, after a night of, like, it's a big vague dream sequence, and then he wakes up and suddenly he has the biological body of a woman, and then sort of has to go on and live his life as a woman. So it's a lot about, sexuality, gender identity, personal identity, who you are, what do you identify as, how do you see yourself, how do you place yourself in the world now that you have to sort of switch from being a part of the patriarchy to being oppressed. There's also a good movie starring Tilda Swinton, who I think is excellent casting for this kind of role. Thing is, I don't really remember that much about Orlando, except that it was written in a style that I thought was a little confusing at times. So I kind of get what the deal with this is, why people like this book as much as they do. Maybe it's just not entirely my thing. So this is a book I would probably say, if you must, well, I would say, check out the synopsis, check out some of the themes, and if they do interest you, and if you can sort of get along with Virginia Woolf's writing style, I think you should definitely give this one a try. Next up, we have, let's do this one. Oh, we got a classic. We got Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, if it wasn't already clear from some of the earlier books I talked about, I'm a big fan of 19th century Victorian Gothic literature. And where would I be if I didn't say that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is one of the best books written in that category? It's probably going to go into literature gods, because Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is great. It has a fantastic concept about the nature of man, the nature of good and evil. Like, what choices do we make? Are we really innately evil? Is it something that's based on nature versus nurture? Is it something that's based on our choices? Is this something that we can defeat, something we can discover within ourselves? There's a lot of nuance there. The book isn't very long. This is like one of those classics you can really read like in one day, one weekend. It's also one of those stories that I think still needs like a super duper accurate adaptation, because I think a lot of people also get details wrong about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But I honestly think this is great. This is a great book, especially if you are into stuff like Edgar Allan Poe, Picture of Dorian Gray, Frankenstein. It's all sort of in the same vein, like this Victorian Gothic kind of literature that is like really about the exploration of the nature of man, the morality of man, like the emotional depth about humanity. And it's also like a bit spooky and messed up. So I'm a big fan of that, which naturally means it's gonna go into God of Literature. And I think we're probably going to encounter the author of that book again. Next up, let's talk about more of an American classic. Let's talk about The Man in the High Castle. Thing is, I wrote my master's thesis on Man in the High Castle. I wrote my master's thesis on alternate history books, and I chose The Man in the High Castle and Making History by Stephen Fry, because I wanted to compare a book I liked with a book I didn't like, and Man in the High Castle was the book I didn't like. So I've read this for the first time years ago, like 5 years ago, 6 years ago or something. Didn't like it at all. Then took that class in alternate history stories. I was like, actually, I really like that topic. I want to talk about it. And was like, well, I have read Man in the High Castle before, so let's choose that one, because the general premise and idea of Man in the High Castle are brilliant. So this is an alternate history story about what if Nazi Germany had won World War II and had conquered the world together with Japan, and America is now occupied by Japan and fascist Germany. And in the middle, in the middle of the United States, there's a sort of neutral zone. So we meet some characters who live within that world on both sides, some of the Japanese occupied side, some of the German occupied side, and we sort of just like find out about the day-to-day life. And there's, as a secondary plotline, there's like a book going around written by a man who is the man in the high castle. And that book, within the world of the man in the high castle, describes a world where Germany lost the war. So the history line that we live in, the timeline we live in. And the concept of that sounds brilliant. Like, I love alternate history stories. Like I said, I literally wrote my master thesis about it. But the thing is, Man in the High Castle is so fucking boring. I hated this book so much because the original premise hasn't really anything to do with the actual story itself, because we just follow boring characters going about their boring day-to-day life, and it's not interesting at all. Like, the actual interesting stuff about, what has changed in the world, what is different in this timeline, is only, like, mentioned sometimes in like one or two of sentences, and you're thinking, that's actually really cool. Like, how they talk about that, I don't know, Nazi Germany has landed on the moon, has occupied Mars, has drained the Mediterranean Sea, stuff like that, and you're like, I want to read about Nazis in space, not about those boring characters going about their boring day-to-day life. Like, what the fuck? And it just bothered me to no end that this book wasted so much potential, also because the man in the high castle, that titular character, isn't even really the main focus of the book. Yes, he does appear, but isn't necessarily the main focus. Another focus that this book has which was very irritating to me, is like a Chinese text, which I think does exist in real life, which is essentially used to, like, not tell the future, but sort of like give indication as to what you should do, like an oracle kind of. And it didn't fit into the rest of the book at all, what the characters were doing, what the world was doing. And I just didn't get it at all. I hated reading this. It was interesting enough to analyze because, like I said, the general premise, super interesting to get into, otherwise bores you to hell. And I'm sorry, Philip. I'm sorry, Philip, but I'm gonna fire you from literary canon. That's what I'm gonna do, even though I studied your book for almost 60 pages of an essay. Next up, let's continue with some fantasy. Let's talk about The Last Unicorn. So I think The Last Unicorn is quite popular. More so the movie, I think, than the book. I first read the book, then years and years later watched the movie. I read the book, it's been a while, like 8 years ago, I think. So it's been a while. Last Unicorn for me is a book I can totally understand why people like this. It's sort of in a similar fashion to a little bit like Tolkien, The Hobbit, that time where where fantasy was a bit more like fairy tale-esque, a bit more vintage. Last Unicorn is a bit more humorous in some aspects as well, like, with Schmendrick the wizard and all that. I think there's some really neat ideas behind it. I think though that I enjoyed the movie even a tiny bit more than the book. The thing is, I can totally see why this is beloved. I just think it wasn't my story, and that's what I think. Which is why personally, this is really more like a personal opinion than really objective. I'm gonna put this in if you must, because I totally understand why people love this. If you want to get like a classic fairy tale-esque fantasy story of back in the day, you can definitely check this one out. Also, if you like the movie, I just think this wasn't like my kind of story. Speaking of stories that disappointed me, weren't really for me, let's talk about Bram Stoker's Dracula. Okay, I've tried reading Dracula multiple times. I've never finished this book. Because turns out Dracula's boring. The book is boring. The first time I tried to read this book was when I was like 17, 18 years old. I was really excited because, I had read stuff, like Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Edgar Allan Poe, like all those gothic stories. And I was like, and now Dracula, because I love vampires, and Dracula is like the one vampire novel you have to read. And then I found out, it's an epistolary novel, which was already a bit of a surprise for me because I didn't know that at all, that it was epistolary, and it was all letters. The story is entirely written in letters. Which you may know I know there's been a trend online to do like Dracula Daily, where you get basically sent emails, like the chapters sent by email to you on the day, as if the characters were writing to you, which, to be fair, is quite a neat idea. Um, but it still doesn't make me like this book very much. I totally get it why this is considered to be like the vampire novel. Because it's sort of what introduced the wider vampire myth to Western like literary canon and all that. I just wish it was written differently. I wish it was written more in a more exciting way, not as freaking letters. I already have difficulty with epistolary novels in general, but I just really don't think it works for a book like Dracula. So if you go into reading that, like really be aware of how this book is written, because it's also like sort of written in retrospect, and it takes a bit of the excitement out of the entire story, I think. It also has like some characters I really don't like all their potential husbands for Lucy is kind of annoying, and I don't know. I also think the novel in general is just like a tad too long for what actually happens. So again, this is really more of a personal thing, because I totally understand why this is so beloved. This is really, again, more of a personal thing. So I'm gonna put it in this one. Really, this is like the one. This is the one vampire story we decided is like the be all and end all, because I don't really get it. I don't know. Let's talk about. Ooh, we got One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Now this is a case of I saw the movie first and then read the book. I saw the movie because it's my mum's favorite movie of all time. I was like, gonna watch it. I fell in love with it. Absolutely love that movie. It's also one of my favorite movies of all time. And then I read the book. Background, I'm probably a bit biased here because I read this book when I was in hospital myself for mental health reasons. So there's a bit of a parallel going on, which was sort of on purpose. Like I bought this book shortly before going to the hospital, knowing that there's going to be a bit of a parallel here when I read this. And while this is a little outdated in some places, I honestly really, really love this book. It's similar to the movie. I can't even really tell you why. I just love the whole premise of a man who isn't even really that likable. He's just an interesting rascal, basically. Like a sort of bad boy, is what you would say nowadays, maybe. Who actually does some bad stuff. Like, some of the stuff he does or has done is inexcusable for why he's there. But it's so interesting to, like, through his eyes, see what happens at the psych ward, to meet all of the other characters out there for different reasons. Some of them are really, really sick and really do need to be there, but also some of them are just held back by the system, held back by the nurse that's there, who's of course like the big bad of the story. I think more people are aware of the movie more so than the book, but I can honestly say if you like the movie, definitely go and read the book. There's also a play based on the book, which I think even came out slightly before the movie, I'm not quite sure, which is also quite good, if you ever want to get into that. I honestly feel like this is an interesting exploration of how we viewed mental health and mental health hospitals back in the day. Like, I think this is a book from the, I want to say 50s or 60s, I'm not quite sure. I would treat it back in the day. Of course, there are some, like I said, like some outdated ideas about, people of color, about women, about the mental health institutions in general, of course. But even then, it's still, I think, an interesting parallel to nowadays, because we still don't treat mentally ill people that well all the time. And I think especially if, similar to me, maybe you have like a history of mental illness, or like were in hospital at some point in your life, I think you will find some kind of connection with this book. And where do I want to put this? It's somewhere here, theoretically. I'm gonna put it in I like this for now, because I think I'm a bit biased if I put it in literature gods, but I think this is still nevertheless a book you should definitely check out, especially if you only know the movie, because I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here. Let's talk about, next up, a bit of a controversial one, I think. Let's talk about Catcher in the Rye. I think Catcher in the Rye is an interesting case because I think a lot of people hate this book because they had to read it in school. Luckily enough, I never had to read this at school. I read this 3 or 4 years ago, of my own volition, because I've been wanting to read this for a while. And I was surprised by how much I actually enjoyed it. Because normally this is the kind of book I would not enjoy that much. It's a book written very much stream of consciousness style from one person's point of view who just tells you about their thoughts and opinions on things while they go about their day. So it's about a young man, I think called Holmes, who just tells us about, he's like a rebel, he's like a bad boy kind of. A bit of a contrarian, a bit of an asshole as well. And he just goes about his day and tells us what happens. Like he talks to his teachers, talks to his friends, spends time with his family, with his, I think, sister, I'm not quite sure, and just tells us about those interactions, all about like the thoughts and opinions he has while all of that stuff is happening. Like I said, very stream of consciousness. And I can't even tell you really why I enjoy it that much. It just vibed with me. It honestly just vibed with me. I can totally see why this maybe annoys people, but then again, I also have to remind you, do you hate it because the book is actually bad, or do you hate it because you had to read it at school? Because there's a difference. So I can totally understand how this caused so much controversy throughout history. And I think this is a very important book, especially about, youth, sort of about growing up, maybe being a bit of a rebel, being a bit chaotic, maybe like on the edge of going off the deep end slightly if something goes wrong. So I wanna, again, it's sort of similar to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where it's sort of between literature gods and, ooh, I like this. So maybe let's put it here, because I can kind of see how not everyone vibes with this one, but I would nevertheless recommend it to anyone who wants like an interesting character study, very much also based on the time when it was written, and someone, especially someone who's like into stream of consciousness writing, someone who really wants like a character study, wants to get deep into like the thoughts of a character. This is definitely like the right book for you. Okay, next up, let's talk about a book and movie classic. Let's talk about Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. I think more people again are maybe familiar with the movie now than the book, but the book is a solid 80s crime thriller. Like honestly, pretty solid. Like I've read this book like 2 or 3 times. My last reread of this was like 5 years ago or something with a book club, and all of us loved it. Because while this book is was written during the 80s or something and was written by a man, Clarice Starling is such a badass female character to read about. Like she really doesn't take any shit. You can see that she has her insecurities, especially like when she has to interact with the other man in the department, when she is sort of a little bit intimidated by Hannibal, but you can see how she works through it, how she stands her, not man, her woman, you know what I mean. And it's totally badass to read about her. And it was really thrilling to like go along with her to solve this case alongside with her. And just honestly, it's just as good as the movie, if you ask me. Obviously, it's also a product of its time. It has some aspects and ideas that we probably wouldn't depict like this nowadays, but I think they're picked up and addressed within the book itself, like especially like, you know, the transgender nature, question mark, of the murderer. But it's also sort of addressed within the book itself, which I thought was quite interesting. And naturally, Thomas Harris has created, I know that Red Dragon came before this, but I think Silence of the Lambs is really the one that made Hannibal Lecter like a character that was really well known within the public consciousness. And Thomas Harris has just created such a fantastically interesting, I don't even want to say villain, because Hannibal Lecter isn't necessarily the villain of the book, but also not anti-hero, antagonist maybe, just a really horrible but interesting person that you just want to know about, similar to Clarice. You're like appalled but also and terrified but also really fascinated by this man. And the highlight of this book are every time Clarice goes and talks to Hannibal. Like, it's just some really peak on the edge psychological play between these two. And it's not just a great crime novel, but a great psychological thriller. Like a battle of minds almost, where Hannibal is ahead, but maybe not always necessarily as ahead as you think. And like Clarice always has a bit of like a trick up her sleeve. So, I want to put this. Why do I want to put this? I'm gonna say God of Literature. Literature God. Yeah, we need more psychological crime thrillers and stories that are like this good. And honestly, it still mostly stand the test of time. Speaking of standing the test of time, let's quickly talk about Harry Potter. I guess you just have to. I mean, you have to. I know I include some other modern classics, and you just have to include Harry Potter. Naturally, disclaimer, we do not support J.K. Rowling and her transphobic views on this channel. But Harry Potter is sort of inevitable if you talk about classic literature. Because I think Harry Potter has created a generation of readers, me included. And it's a bit difficult to say if this falls for me to, ooh, I like this, or God of Literature. Because, excuse me. Because this has created like such a big ripple that's lasting until, like, this book and this book series still has impact on people until this very day. So much so that it's become like a huge topic online, of course, if, you know, people hate the author, but they still want to engage with the story because it's just so beloved, which is totally understandable. And I feel like, honestly, if I put Hunger Games in Literature God, I sort of have to put Harry Potter there as well, because Harry Potter has simply had such a long-lasting, heavy impact on the fantasy genre, on just kids, on generations of reader as a whole, that it cannot be understated how important this was to like a whole generation of kids who picked this up, who had never read a book before and loved the story, who then maybe became writers themselves. So, hate the author, but you have to admit that this had quite a heavy influence. So, I'm gonna put it here also simply because it's a fun book. It's not my favorite within the series, but it's definitely one of the stronger novels within the series. And I think it has this great balance of where it's a children's book, but one that people of any age can read, because it just has so many fun characters, so many details where you're like, yeah, sure, if you question them, you immediately start unraveling like a bit of plot holes. But as a kid, you just have so much fun with this, and it had such big impact, I think, on a whole generation that you just have to admit that it's one of the most impactful books that's ever been written. Now, let's talk about Ian McEwan, and let's talk about Atonement. Atonement, I will say, it's been a while since I read this book. Read this like 6 or 7 years ago. I love the movie. The movie is great. Atonement, the book, is okay. I remember that I had a very interesting time with it because the narrative, of course, is quite interesting in regards to how reliable is the narrator. I love books that in general play around with unreliable narrators, like what is being told to the reader, is it actually true? What are the events we're reading? Are they can they really be trusted? Are we even being told the real version? Like, who are these characters and what are they doing with the story that's being told to us? Totally interesting. I think the second half of the book is a bit more interesting than the first half. Like, the second half is all about the war, the first half is about the childhood of the main character. And honestly, the twist sort of at the end, it sort of hits you with a gut punch. I totally get the emotional impact this had on probably like a bunch of readers. So, I think this is enjoyable. I still think the movie's a bit better. And I'm gonna say it's like, for me personally, it's somewhere between If You Must and this one, really. Because it has like an interesting narration, but that's sort of all I remember about it. Like, it wasn't really anything beyond that for me personally, but I can totally understand why this book would be beloved and taught at schools. I mean, I literally had to read this at university. Um, the thing is, I enjoyed these books in If You Must more than Atonement. So it would be between these two, but since I can't do that, I'm gonna put it here, but it's also more of a positive connotation that if I personally don't really get the hype around this book, but I would kind of understand it if someone told me that they love this book. Let's talk about more fantasy classics. Let's talk about Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, Chronicles of Narnia. Surprise, I actually had to read this for university as well. Because I read this in a seminar about literature and religion. Because, I mean, I think everyone knows that, you know, these books are quite heavily religiously influenced. You know, Aslan is Lion Jesus. It's a rather short book, actually. I got it somewhere here. Like, it's like this thin. It's like, it's really not that big. You can read it in like one day. And it's a kid's book. I totally get it. The writing is very heavy-handed, though. It's sort of simplistic. You can totally tell what the themes are. It's not like it's really that subtle. Maybe I like the movie in this case a bit more. It again has like those very classic fairy tale vibes of those like early, like first half of the 20th century fantasy. Maybe it's just because I personally don't enjoy the religious themes all that much, which is more of a personal thing. This isn't necessarily a book that I would recommend if you like really want to get into classic fantasy, to be honest. Maybe watch the movie. The movie's fun. Also, I think this is the second book, actually, chronologically within the series. So there's a book theoretically before that, but I mean, this is the one everyone knows. I think it's a bit hard. I do think it's worth a read. If you really do want to get into some like classic children's fantasy, but honestly, don't expect too much, really. And again, I'm basing this purely on, do I like this as much as these in If You Must? And I'm not quite sure if I did. But then again, I think I did enjoy it more than Dracula. And Game of Thrones, I don't know. It's difficult. Like, again, this one sort of falls between these two categories for me. So, I'm going to be nice with this one for some reason and put it here, but it's like the very low bottom half of this one. Like, it's very close to like going into this one, really. Again, not necessarily a book I would recommend as a classic fantasy read. Maybe read somewhat like one or two other books and then get into Narnia if you want to. But I can totally see why these books are beloved. I would get if someone told me they really, really like these books. Maybe they're just not my cup of tea. Let's pick up a foreign book. Let's talk about Faust by Goethe. Now, this is peak German literature. This is the book German kids have to read at school. It says part 1 because there is theoretically, well, and practically, a part 2, but no one ever talks about part 2. No one reads part 2 because part 2 is boring, way too complex, and no one cares. So when we talk about Faust, we only really talk about the first half. That's what everyone means when they talk about Faust. They mean part 1. No one cares about part 2. So Faust, naturally, of course, is the story about a man who makes a deal with the devil, with Mephistopheles, to like be cool and young and hip, you know, that kind of thing. And that's how he makes a deal with the devil. Of course, things go wrong. The devil seduces him to do awful things. There's a bit of a love story going on that's doomed to be tragic. All of that. I really like this. I remember when I think I've read this once or twice. I've read this in German and in English, actually. Naturally, it's a bit of an old-fashioned book. I don't remember from which century it is. Yeah, if you want to get into this, prepare for like some old-fashioned language. Maybe you can also grab a copy that has like more of a modern day translation. If you can read it in the original, please do. I think this has wonderful language. I think it's very poetic. I think it's of course very like religiously themed as well, but also similar to a bit of like the Picture of Dorian Gray. It's all about how much do you allow yourself to indulge? How much do you allow yourself to be sinful? What is a good amount to be sinful, sort of thing. Like, is it okay to like indulge in some stuff? Yes, but how far do you go with that? And are you willing to like literally sell your soul to the devil to be forever young? That kind of stuff. So very sort of similar theming to Picture of Dorian Gray, maybe. And I mean, Faust is a play, first of all. You can read this in like one afternoon. But given like all the not just the old-fashioned language, but also the themes addressed within this book, I think warrant like a lot of analysis. You could like really get into a lot of like nuance, like so many nuances and details with this book. I mean, for good reason. This is one of the German literary texts. So, I'm gonna say, because I totally get Goethe, I never got Kafka. I will say I like this. Honestly, if you want to get into like some foreign classics, some German classics, maybe definitely check this one out. Also, if you like a fan, not quite as gothic-y as like Picture of Dorian Gray or stuff like that, but if you want some similar themes surrounding like the identity and the morality of man, about like some slightly more religious themes, then that is definitely a book I think you will like, and something I personally also enjoy very much, and it's one of the better plays I've read. Now, let's talk about an author we've had before. Let's talk about Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson as well. So this is the same chap who also wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I think is quite funny, because on the one hand we have like this dark, gothic-y, violent story about the good and evil within man, and then on the other hand you have the fun pirate treasure story. I've read this one, what means quite recently, 2 or 3 years ago, after watching a truly amazing performance of like a play version of Treasure Island, which was a lot of fun. Treasure Island, I think, falls into this category of like a really fun classic adventure story. It has definitely helped to create this classic picture of the treasure-seeking pirate that we now have within sort of Western culture. You can definitely see with this book where those ideas are coming from. And I think this is a bit similar to, Lost World or the Jules Verne books. This is really like just a fun, fantastical adventure story. Like, if you're into pirates, you basically have to read this. If you're not so much into pirates, not necessarily. I think I'm gonna put this in if you must, because it's sort of in a similar vein to The Lost World, where this is like just a really fun adventure story that was written at the time that has helped to like create some of the stereotypes and cliches that we now have about pirates. I can totally see why people love this. I can totally see why some people would say, it's a bit boring and it's not really a lot of stuff happening. It's a bit annoying. I totally get that. Personally, I had some fun with it. I had fun with it. I would say, yeah, sure. If you're like into pirate stories, if you're like into like classic adventure stories of the time, definitely check this one out. And last, but by no means least, we have The Little Prince. Little Prince is arguably the first book I've ever read, like proper book, because I remember I got an audiobook edition of The Little Prince for my first day of school. My parents, as a present, gave me an audiobook of The Little Prince, and I devoured that. I've listened to it so many times over the years. I listened to it like so many times that at some point I was able to like just recite almost the entire book verbatim because I had listened to the audiobook so many times. And before we go, I need to go into this. It's gonna lie in literature gods because Little Prince is just amazing. It's such an emotional, fun, cute, deep philosophical story about a man who at first tells us that he has sort of trouble growing up. You know, it's sort of about a man who was told that he can no longer be childish, and he grows up to be a pilot in World War II, which is also what happened to the author. And then he strands his plane in the desert. And suddenly in the desert, while he's feeling absolutely god-awful, a little boy just walks up to him and is like, "Can you draw me a sheep?" He's like, "What?" And then the story unfolds, and it's about this little boy who tells him what he has experienced, that he's traveled from his little planet, which is tiny, 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 like only has space for like himself, his rose, and like a garden and a table. And then he just decides to go out and find friends to discover who else is out there. And he goes and talks to like all kinds of different people. There's always like sort of a lesson to be learned after he's talking to some people, like what you should truly focus on in life. And then when he lands on Earth, he tries to make friends. And eventually there's this whole sequence, which I think is rather well known, where the little prince meets a fox. And the fox teaches him how to make friends. The fox is like, "Well, you have to tame me. We can't just simply talk and be friends. You have to tame me." Which essentially is like how to make friends, kind of. And there's some really, truly beautiful lines in this book about friendship, what it means to grow up how you are, a nice person, how you perceive yourself, how you perceive others, how you treat others. I don't remember what the actual quote is from the book, but there's a line which I think is rather well known that says something along the lines of, "You can only truly see with the heart. The important things are invisible to the eye. So the heart knows, not necessarily what you see, but the heart knows. What you feel is true. That's what counts." And that is so beautiful in a book, in a story that's essentially maybe meant for children, meant for kids. Like I said, I got this when I was like 6 years old, and even then, I couldn't explain it, but I understood why I liked this, why this was important. For some reason, it even makes me emotional now a bit to talk about it. And it's so also tragically beautiful how the whole story ends with a little prince. And again, it's a book, it's very short. You can read it in like one day, one afternoon even. And it's truly, truly beautiful. And maybe even the reason why I love reading now, considering this is like essentially the first book I ever read. And honestly, if you read like one book to your children, make it this one. It's honestly utterly, utterly beautiful. And if you haven't read this yet, I can only urge you to do so. Here we are. I ranked so many books. I'm sorry that this took ages, but honestly, I like shooting long videos, and it's the kind of content I like to watch, so I hope you also had fun listening to me talk for like 2 hours or something about classic literature. I totally want to do this again at some point on Elsa. I totally want to know what your opinions are, because I know I probably had one or two controversial opinions on some books here. I ended up putting most books in literature gods, which I did not expect, to be honest. Like, it's a nice little staircase that I created here. So maybe I'm just nice. Maybe I'm just nice with literature. But please do tell me do tell me down in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on how I rank these books. What are some of your favorite classics that you've read? What are some classics that I still need to read? I know that there are many, many authors and classic books out there that I even own but haven't read yet. For example, like I really want to get into like some Russian classics. I also really want to get back into Jane Austen, because I have tried to read Jane Austen before, but I think at the time when I really wasn't ready for that kind of story yet, and I would be a bit more open to now. It's like so many more classics I want to get into. That's like one of the things I want to read more of this year. So maybe in like 1 or 2 years we can come back and rank some more classic books. But for now, I hope this helped you to maybe discover some new classics, or maybe helped you to decide, oh, I wasn't really sure yet if I should get into this, but maybe now I helped you to decide, yes, I do want to read that, or maybe I should really avoid this book. Well, I've been talking for so long. Thanks so much if you've made it this far. If you're curious about books I'm reading, follow me on Goodreads or on Storygraph. Links for those profiles are down in the description below. Make sure to follow me on there if you want to know what I'm reading at the moment. Well, thank you so much for watching this. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't done it already. And I'll see all of you very soon. Goodbye.